the next... Oh, hang on, there we go. Wait for a moment while the technology works. There we go, fantastic. Is Christianity intolerant? Well, a few years ago, a friend of mine was having dinner with a work colleague and his colleague's wife. And during the meal, questions about sort of spirituality had come up. My friend had done the kind of have you ever wondered thing, and actually that had worked, and conversations had begun. And obviously, during the context of that, my friend mentioned to his colleague that he was a Christian. And the moment he mentioned the word Christian, the word spiritual was fine, but the moment he mentioned the word Christian, he said the atmosphere noticeably chilled, went down a few degrees, and then his colleague's wife said, Oh, I didn't have you down as those kind of people who hate lesbians, gays, and transsexuals. That certainly put a chill on the third course. You see, the thing is, for years, I think the problem we have is that as Christians, we've grown up assuming that our friends and our colleagues, although they may disagree with our religious beliefs, nevertheless, perhaps at least respect that we have some kind of faith. After all, we're the good guys, right? As Christians, we like to think we're the good guys. I mean, look at all the things that the church has done and continues to do for the poor, for example. You know, even if you're not a Christian, at least you can appreciate the stuff that Christians have done. But we're now living in an age where maybe we're not seen as the good guys anymore. And we need to think about how we evangelize in the context of that. In fact, the way that the church is viewed reminds me of a famous BBC comedy sketch from a few years ago. Let's see if this clip works.
Very well. They're coming. Now we'll see how these Russians deal with a crack SS division.
Hans?
Have courage, my friend.
Yeah. Hans, I've just noticed something.
These communists are all cowards.
Have you looked at our caps recently?
Our caps?
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit?
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't, sir.
Hans, are we the baddies?
So that's a very famous Mitchell and Webb sketch on, are we the bad guys? And in fact, a friend of mine who's an evangelist down in Australia actually picked up on that idea and that title, the book he wrote a couple of years ago called Being the Bad Guys, How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says That You Shouldn't. And Stephen points out in that book that we should be aware, if we are not already aware, how the secular world sees us. And of course, it sees Christians that way, not least because many of the things the Bible says. For many of our secular friends, the things that the Bible says about sexuality, the things that it says about marriage, the things that it says about how we should use our time and our money, the things that it says about the uniqueness of Jesus and a world of other faiths can seem quite shocking to our friends who are outside the church. And that's when many people think of Christianity or the church or the Bible, I think tragically their first reaction is that it's narrow, it's restrictive, it's oppressive, it's intolerant. The Bible is full of rules and regulations. And thus I've had people say to me things like, well, the Bible is totally against our freedom. Christianity is against my freedom. It's restrictive, and therefore it has no place today. In fact, to give you a flavor of that, here is the late atheist Christopher Hitchens, one of the most best-selling atheist writers of the last 20 or 30 years. Listen to Christopher in full force. Chris says, we are in need of a new enlightenment which can depose the scrutiny of sacred texts that are found to be corrupted and confected. The pursuit of unfettered scientific inquiry will result in the divorce between the sexual life and fear, the sexual life and disease, and the sexual life and tyranny. Powerful words, right? In other words, he's saying the Bible is anti-freedom. In the West, our culture, we are pro-freedom, and so no wonder that many of my friends And my neighbors, your friends, your neighbors, perhaps when they think of Christianity, consider it to be intolerant, restrictive, and narrow. But the issue is freedom. We live in a culture that thinks that everything is about freedom, and therefore, how on earth would you want to believe something that restricts that? How on earth would we begin engaging with that kind of culture? Well, I'd suggest we might want to begin thinking our way into this question by taking a little look at that word freedom for a moment. One of my favorite movies is the entirely historically accurate action-adventure movie Braveheart. William Wallace did indeed have an Australian accent. And in fact, one of my most terrifying experiences actually was I remember watching that movie in a cinema in Edinburgh. And I have a suspicion I was potentially the only English person in the audience, because every time an Englishman got killed on screen, the whole cinema erupted and, "Way!" And there was me kind of sinking down into my seat, hoping that I didn't get noticed. But of course, if you've seen that movie, there's that famous line. The most famous line, I think, in Braveheart is when William Wallace, played, as I say, by Mel Gibson with an authentically Scottish accent, shouts to his troops before the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Do you remember the cry? "They can take our lives, but they can never take our freedom." And see, freedom is a powerful idea in our culture. It's a very powerful idea in Western culture. In fact, the eminent sociologist Robert Bellah, who conducted a long-term study over 20 years of Western culture, one of the most eminent sociologists in living memory, concluded this at the end of his massive study of our culture. He said, for Westerners, freedom was perhaps the most important value. And I meet so many people for whom this is the hang-up when it comes to Christian faith. They want to be free, they think freedom is what matters, and they think that Christianity is restrictive, and that's why Christianity is considered intolerant. You know, we live in a culture that says freedom is the main thing that matters. You should be free to make the choices you want, free to choose the ethics you want, free to sleep with the people you want, however you want, free to live your life the way that you want. Our culture teaches us that choice and freedom is good, and the more choice, the better. And of course, if that is your view of reality, no wonder that our friends are going to look at the Christian faith and wonder what relevance it could have to them. But when I talk about this on university campuses and to skeptical audiences, I often like to say, well, maybe one reason we've got into a little bit of a confusion around this issue is we haven't thought all that hard about what the word freedom actually means. You know, most people, if you ask them, will probably define the word freedom meaning there are no constraints. I'm free if I have no restrictions upon me. I can do whatever I want. But there are a number of problems, I think, if you define freedom that way. Not least, I think that definition of freedom is patently false, demonstrably unjust, and actually fundamentally self-destructive. In fact, let me share with you this morning just two problems if you try and define freedom as the absence of all constraints and therefore dismiss Christianity on that basis. The first problem, of course, is if you say that freedom is the absence of any constraints, is that view of freedom is completely impossible, utterly impossible. And the reason it's impossible is that our desires conflict. For example, I would love to be free. I want to be free to eat as many donuts as possible. Possibly a JCB digger would actually be involved in this exercise. But I also want to be free to try and run a mile in under 6 minutes. My son and I have taken up running this year. We have our eyes set on being able to do a park run, 5K round about Easter. At the moment, I can just about waddle around the block. The problem is those two desires conflict. If I stuff my face with inane amounts of donuts, I'm not going to meet my running goal. And if we are honest, we all face these kind of issues. We all have competing desires. If we look at the things that we long for, the things that we want, the freedoms we would love, we are not free to pursue all of them. As the Christian writer and pastor Tim Keller put it succinctly, he said, at the level of lived life, there are numerous freedoms, and nobody can have all of them. So what do we therefore have to do? Well, therefore, what we have to do, of course, is decide which freedom is the more important one and which ones I need to sacrifice. If I'm going to hit my running goal, I'm going to have to sadly sacrifice a few donuts. You see, however much we may like to shout, I am completely free, life doesn't work like that. We bang up against the real world. I may shout as loudly as I like that I am free to choose donuts and running, but ultimately my body is not going to agree. It wasn't designed that way. And that gets us to something really important to help our friends think about. Real freedom, I think, is not the absence of constraints, but the right constraints, finding those things that we were designed for flourishing as human beings. And that raises the question, what is it we were designed for as human beings? You see, figuring out what something is designed for is actually really, really quite important. One of my hobbies a few years ago was drone flying. I bought myself one of these kind of funky flying cameras and had huge fun flying it around the place and doing aerial photography. And the instruction manual that came with my drone, there weren't many instructions in there, but one thing it said in bold red letters underlined was do not fly the drone in enclosed spaces. Do not fly inside, do not fly in woods, those kind of things. Fly where you're not going to hit anything. Well, after a couple of years of messing around with my drone, I found myself thinking, I'm quite a good pilot now. I know what I'm doing. And the woods near where my house lives, I think I could get an amazing shot if I flew my drone backwards along the bridleway and took this lovely shot of the woods in the winter and the snow. And so I tried this, and I flew into a branch, and I did several £100 worth of damage because I hadn't used something in the way that it was designed for. And so the same question goes for human beings. What are we designed for? What are the things that if we do, we're going to flourish? The things if we're not going to do, we're going to live badly. So that's the first question that I think we can get our friends to think about. But the second problem with defining freedom as being able to do whatever I want with absolutely no restrictions, certainly no religious restrictions, is that, of course, total freedom destroys all relationships. Total freedom destroys all relationships. As you think about this for a moment, to be in any serious kind of relationship, you are going to have to make a few sacrifices. You're going to have to sacrifice some of your freedom. This year, I'm going to celebrate my 25th wedding anniversary. 25 years ago since my wife and I got married. We actually met on the 1st of April 1997, which my wife says should have been a clue, really. But we have almost made 25 years. But I still remember that when I got married in 1998, I very quickly discovered when I was married that some things now changed with married life. I was no longer free to do entirely what I wanted. If I stayed late with my friends at the pub and didn't tell Astrid where I was, there was grief when I got home. If I went out and spent lots of money on a drone, for example, and didn't sort of discuss this with the other half in the relationship, again, there were problems. Now I have children. This is my wonderful family playing dress up at a castle. Now I have kids. Of course, I have even more constraints. It's meant considerable sacrifices and limits on my freedom. But do I consider that to be a negative thing? No, I don't, because with that comes the positive thing of a relationship with people I care deeply about. You see, we can't be totally free in the way that our culture tells us and be in a close, loving relationship that really counts. But is that a price worth paying? As I say, I think it is. I've sacrificed a lot and given up significant freedoms to have a marriage, to have a relationship with my kids. Yet I don't feel I've been abused. I don't feel I've been restricted. I don't feel I've lost something. I feel that I've gained something. And I think one of the things we need to push back on is this idea in our culture that freedom is everything. Freedom isn't everything. And I reckon most of our friends and neighbors and colleagues, if the choice was complete freedom or to be truly and entirely loved for who we are, most people would actually go for the latter. But there's another deeper question here that ties into this whole question of restriction and intolerance and these ways that people sometimes misunderstand the Christian faith. And it's the question, and it's this issue. You see, nobody is ultimately free because all of us are serving something. All of us are serving something. Every human being is living for something. Maybe you're living for academic grades. Maybe you're living for a particular relationship. Maybe you're living for your career or your popularity or for sporting success. Maybe your friends are living for some hobby they're committed to. What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? What is it that makes life worth living? And all of our friends who don't have a religious faith will have something they are living for, something that makes their life have purpose and point to it. And the thing is, I often say to my friends who are not Christians, that thing that is the object of your joy and your purpose and your happiness, that thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, is actually the thing that is controlling you. It's actually controlling you, because if it was taken away, you'd end up with all kinds of problems. I used this story at the pub last night, so for the 3 or 4 of you who are here, who are there, you'll have heard this story before, but this gentleman on the screen behind me is David Foster Wallace. David was a Pulitzer Prize nominated novelist, a writer, and an author, very, very gifted writer. Not a Christian, somebody who would probably describe himself as an agnostic. He didn't really know what he thought about spiritual things. But he reflected, as many writers have, deeply on the human condition, and once wrote something that I consider to be very wise and insightful. Listen to his words and say, when you realize he's not coming from a Christian, but somebody who didn't really know what he believed, they're all the more powerful. David wrote, he said, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice you get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. It is the truth. If you worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. If you worship power, you will feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. And I think what David is nudging at here is that whatever is the source of a person's meaning, satisfaction, joy, energy, well, the thing is you have to have it. You need it. You're almost like an addict. You have to have that thing. And because of that, the prospect of losing it, if it's your standard of living, a particular relationship, a job, your academic reputation, that thing ends up controlling you. Effectively, it becomes a god to you. And the problem is, of course, if you serve your career or your success and you fail, or it comes to an end, it will end up crucifying you inside with hatred, anxiety, and jealousy and self-loathing. By contrast, at the heart of the Bible's message stands that incredibly freeing message that Jesus was crucified for us. And I always want to say to my friends, look, if you follow Jesus, yes, there will be constraints, and yes, it will affect your freedom, but then everybody lives for something. And the thing that you're already living for, if it's not Jesus, is still already your master and controlling you and telling you what to do. The question our friends should be asking is not, will I serve something and face restrictions? The question is, what or who will I serve? And are the restrictions the right ones that are going to help me to thrive as a human being? See, if the God described by the Bible exists, then of course he made us, he designed us, he knows us, he loves us, and he wants the best for us. And thus living for God means becoming what we were meant to be, being fully and authentically human. And I often say to people, actually, this is very much in some ways like falling in love. Because I think the incredible message of the Bible is that when you grasp what God in Jesus has done for you, when you appreciate that tremendous price that he paid for you, and the way that Jesus gave up his freedom and his security and humbled himself even to the point of death on a cross, when you actually get your head around what that is saying, then it makes you want to respond out of gratitude and love. But of course, falling in love, as we've seen, means a loss of independence, and it only works if both parties in the relationship are willing to give up some of their freedom, otherwise there is no relationship. But isn't it amazing when you think about it, that the incredible news of the gospel is that Jesus has already done that for us. He has taken the initiative. He died for us before we responded. He showed his love for us before we responded. He showed his love for us even while we were still his enemies. He laid down his freedom for us when he was nailed to the cross in order that we might know life's true purpose and a relationship with God. And now Jesus says to us and says to our friends, I have laid down my freedom so that a relationship might be possible. Are you now willing to respond and lay down yours? And one of the verses I love to weave into conversations when I'm talking to skeptical audiences is those beautiful words in Matthew chapter 11, where Jesus said, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I want to be saying to my friends, look, you can choose to serve your career. You can choose to serve your sexuality. You can choose to serve your image or your performance, all of those things, but those things will ultimately destroy you. They are not kind masters. They promise freedom, but actually only offer servitude. Or you can choose to serve the one who created you, the one who, rather than lay you down with burdens, has taken up our burdens, the one who looks at you and says, not merely do I know who you were intended to be because I made you, but the one who looks at us and says, if you fall and stumble, I won't break you, but I will forgive you. Is Christianity intolerant and out of date and irrelevant and restrictive because what it says contradicts our freedom? I can understand why at first glance it might appear that way to postmodern eyes. But maybe the eyes of our friends are a little bit jaded. And maybe our culture has sold too many people a false view of freedom. And one thing we can encourage our friends to do is perhaps take a hard look at their assumptions. You see, when it comes to the big questions of life, why we're here, what our purpose is, what is the value of a life, how to address challenges like suffering and injustice, maybe actually ignorance isn't actually bliss. Maybe our friends need a wake-up call, like some of the things the Bible says on these issues, a voice from outside our time and culture. Is the Bible outdated and intolerant? Well, if anything, it's never been more relevant, actually. As Bono, the lead singer of U2, once remarked, he said, the goal is soul. And if that's true, we can have no better roadmap than the Bible. A map that if we follow it, and we encourage our friends to follow it, can lead us home to the God who created us, the God who loves us, and the God who is able to meet all of our needs. Our need for meaning, our need for purpose, our need for identity, our need for forgiveness, and the one who offers us and our friends the true freedom that makes all of those things possible. Thank you for listening. Matt is going to come and explain what's happening next.